So, hi everyone. I'm here with Hanif Joshaghani, who's the CEO of Symend, and Symend are in the behavioral analytics and contact optimization space. So, Hanif, thanks very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And I know it's very early in the morning where you are. So,
No problem. Happy to do it. It's like probably one of the few times that it's quiet here.
yeah, well, it's always good to get up early and get some stuff done. That's for sure.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I thought it'd be good just to talk about behavioral science. At least talk about that a little bit in terms of like maybe just a bit of a primer around sort of what is behavioral science and are we thinking about those kind of things correctly, really, and why it's important for a lot of us, particularly in the collection space, which is where I work, but generally.
Yeah. So the discipline of behavioral science, I mean, it's a fairly big academic area.
Mm,
The applications are quite broad. Like you hear about behavioral science, like behavioral scientists end up working in everything from healthcare
mm,
to, government jobs when they're trying to figure out policy and how to design things for a specific outcome with a population to, even in the military
mm,
complex, you have a lot of behavioral scientists. In large technology companies like Samsung and Apple, you have a lot of behavioral scientists. So
mm,
the applications are quite broad because at the end of the day, whatever its form and manifestation, what you're trying to ultimately do is apply a set of scientific principles to the way you design things that people receive
mhm,
so that you can control for the emotional coefficient of how they feel about it,
mm,
right? From a human perspective. So in the case of healthcare, one of the most common applications is the way you design even little things like behavioral design when it comes to labeling and even nomenclature for medicine, or
mm,
trying to nudge to people to how they feel about things like sugar or self-help, etc. In the case of government, the most obvious case that everybody always teaches you in behavioral science is the back of your driver's license. So that's a really big policy one where governments are trying to get as many people, if God forbid they have an accident, to be organ donors. Well,
mm,
the thing is, if you say, hey, would you like to opt in? And the check boxes to opt into being an open donor, you only get like a 20-30% uptake rate.
mm,
Whereas like if you click, then people have to mentally decide to remove that
mm,
benefit from the rest of society, right? All of a sudden, people who are willing to do it, that little change, you end up going from 20-30% to 60-70%.
yeah.
So that's really what behavioral science is about designing communication, visuals, labeling anything with human psychology, human behaviors in mind so that you can modulate control for it to optimize towards a certain outcome.
And I suppose some of the psychology of it has probably been around for a while. I suppose why are we seeing this big sort of surge in, and particularly financial services and sort of telecommunications and utilities, etc. Those sort of places. Why are we seeing a surge in those kind of industries which we haven't necessarily heard of before? Because it feels like it's been definitely an area of interest and an area of focus of almost like new technology to a certain extent, even though some of the ideas might have been around for a while in academic areas.
Yeah, so I think it's the patient zero for why you hear about it now is more or less the one really important thing, which is the ability to deploy it right from a distribution perspective in
Mm,
a consistent and scalable way. So I'm
mm,
not sure if you're familiar with the two sigma problem in education, where they took two groups and
mm,
one group got personalized tutoring and
mm,
classwork and stuff like that, and the other group got like very very good education but not personalized to their individual and how they
mm,
want to learn, etc. And invariably the people that get the personalized experience always end up getting better educated. Well, the same
mm,
is true in almost everything, right?
mm,
Like personalization, at the end of the day, the reason why it matters is because there are probably something like 3 to 9 to 15 parameters that you
mm,
could probably, if you want to simplify the world, imagine if you had 9 parameters and every parameter could be a high, medium, low, right? Then the different types of permutations of the way I would receive education or I would receive a message versus you are going to be completely different. Now, in the real world, it's not 9 parameters, it can be significantly more. And there's not
mm,
3 choices per parameter, there's significantly more. So all of a sudden, the way you could have almost like sequence individuals, it becomes incredibly personalized. And if you can in a very cost efficient way, personalized to the person, and that requires you to have that ability to control all of those variables, and then secondly, to learn and iterate so that you can map whatever it is that you're doing to that individual's ideal
Mm.
way of receiving the information. Then all of a sudden the lift is significantly more. The big challenge in education when the Two Sigma problem originally came up was it's too expensive to give everybody personal tutoring. So
Mm.
technology is, I think, especially with the advent of AI, the efficiencies in things like cloud compute, things like that, the the ability to personalize in a meaningful scientific way, not just for the sake of personalization, using
Mm.
a data-driven, science-first approach to doing it, not just in the case of like engagement and collections and all these things we're going to talk about, but in almost every field is going to have a
Mm.
profound impact on the affordability of personalization in a way that improves the way people get their services
Yeah.
and their important things. And that's really what's making a behavioral science super important now, because it's one of the guiding areas of learning in academia, where if you productize it now, it could have real life positive impacts.
Yeah, and I suppose you talked about AI. I think we probably met before ChatGPT came out.
Yeah,
Can't
we
quite
did.
remember, right? It's like I'm like the world feels like that's kind of changed, and it's sort of like, how do you think the interface of that is with behavioral science? Because I mean, as you say, it's almost like, I mean, even like surfing the web or surfing questions, you can actually, or surf asking questions, you can actually ask questions of something which is so much more efficient. It's almost like personalized search or personalized information to go and get that, or go and get that about my account. And it means the amount of time I have to spend doing something is much less because I just ask the direct questions. But I suppose, how do you wrap that in with behavioral science? Because it's also about the psychology of what questions I'm asking, how you respond to it, and those kind of things in terms of
Yeah,
getting the response back. I mean, what's your current thinking around that?
it's a great question. So I mean, this is still like developing, so I can only give you what I think as of today.
Yeah, yeah.
We The accessibility of information is significantly improved, but
Mm.
the one of the challenges I find, and I use ChatGPT pretty much every day. Like
Yeah,
I use AI tools every day in my job now. Like
yeah,
and I used to read 25 to 50 pages a night. I'm doing is reading about the new products and tooling that's coming out, because the
yeah.
speed at which it's coming out. I would say, as far as behavioral science is concerned and the way it's applied is concerned, um, the accessibility to get to minimum viable good is actually completely a game changer. And
Mm.
because a lot, like you said, behavioral science is a very well researched field of academia. So there's a ton of white papers and scholarly work and stuff like that, that very likely a lot of these models, like for sure, I've seen it, like these models have had access to and they've been trained on. So
Mm.
it's out there. It's in the training of most of these big foundation models now. The thing that I worry about, and this is where, I think is going to be true in a lot of fields, to be honest with you, is if you get science wrong, even a little,
Mm.
the impact of it could be profound. And
Mm.
so, for example, again, I'm going to go back to my example of my matrix of permutations, right?
Mm.
Like personalizing within that is super important, but like getting one of those parameters wrong because you didn't have the analytic context. And so when it gave you an answer, you couldn't tell. This is
Mm.
the thing that I worry about. You couldn't tell if it was a good answer or not. It
Mm.
looks like a really legitimate good answer, but it's off enough that when you try to put that into practice, it could do more harm than good. And
Mm.
so that's where I worry. I think it's going to get solved, because I think you're starting to see it in things like Bing, where they're starting to like source everything. But who really looks at the sourcing is what I
Mm.
worry about. So there's I think it's going to have a very profound positive impact on accessibility, but accuracy and making sure, I don't think the need for experts is going to go away, because you, at least for now, until you can really rely on the consistency and the quality of the response. Because when
Mm.
you're applying something like behavioral science to something really important, where the degree by which you can be off is small,
Mm.
then you're gonna have to accept what it is, which is a
Yeah.
good starting point, but don't take it as like gospel and the Ten Commandments and go apply it right away. That I
Yeah.
think is too risky.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of good coaching. We used to have this thing called spurious accuracy, right? So you can calculate, I don't know, g or pi to a thousand decimal places, but that's just a calculation. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually accurate, right? And if you get something
Exactly.
wrong, it might look right, but it might actually not be right. So you've got to sort of have that sort of like almost like sense check to make it. Does this sort of make sense? And the other thing you made me think of is it's almost like in like interpersonal relationships. If you say something that's super personalized, it might go down really, really well, but it might also have the opposite effect, right? Just think about it in terms of like conversations you have, and you've got to be careful with that, I suppose, when you systematize it and you don't have the oversight from a human point of view. So
Yeah.
that sort of chimes in terms of like important kind of considerations, at least to me, at least anyway. So bringing this back to, I suppose, financial services and sort of telecommunications. I mean, how do you sort of like see that these kind of like use cases getting used in what is like the businesses, I suppose.
Yeah. So look, at the highest level, and I think this problem is going to get more and more acute. One of the things that not just AI, but this string of innovations has done is it's opened up and really democratized people's ability to send messages. A
Mm,
lot of them, often. And so you're seeing, and we live in a world where people are making more decisions every day than ever before. Like we're
mm,
probably up to like 12 or 13,000 decisions a day. So by the end of the day, Friday, you're pretty
mm.
exhausted and you're in a state of
Yeah.
paralysis. Being personalized is not a silver bullet, but is one of the key mechanisms of breaking through that freeze.
Mm,
So when you think about the application in a world of communication where there's a lot of noise, right?
mm,
Like, and the rate of noise is only going up, you again the need for personalization. Like we always talk to our customers, we're like, look, the goal is not to send more messages, the goal is to send less. The goal
mm,
is to get to the right conversation and the right outcome with as few interactions with your customer as possible, because the more messaging you have to load up to them, the more you're exasperating that digital fatigue and the decision fatigue, and it becomes white noise. It becomes less and less effective over time.
mm,
So the ability to basically leverage behavioral science to trigger a better emotional response sooner, so the message doesn't get washed away in the noise,
mm,
is super important. And I think that problem is going to become a bigger one over time. So a lot of these companies have spent a lot of money building massive tech stacks that sometimes look more like a Frankenstein thing, because
mm,
different leadership, different groups, different set of technology, and it's really hard to rip and replace. And it takes years to do it sometimes with these orgs. And so they just keep patching things on top of it. And so what you end up with is a like lack of agility, and so like they just send more messages. They're not able to be agile, be learn and iterate. Some of these things are
mm,
not in their disposals, so they basically just load the customer more. You do that across lots and lots of people, then the need to specifically and personally be personalized just gets bigger and bigger. So I think spamming is going to become a bigger and bigger problem. Messaging is going to become a bigger and bigger problem. And so companies that can break through and have that right conversation with their customers with fewer touches, that I think is going to be the key to
yeah.
success.
So I suppose we've always had this concept, certainly in the telephony world, of FPOC, I suppose, first point of contact. You want to try and get things resolved on the call. And I suppose
Yes,
what you're saying is don't just look at telephone calls, but look at all the different
everything.
communication channels you've got and try and minimize, and it's a great metric, isn't it? Number of contacts to
Number of
outcome,
touches. Exactly.
and how do you reduce it and how do you reduce it?
You
Um,
have to, and because what you'll see is, and a lot of people don't measure these things, but like the rate of engagement, if you're not being smart about this, will drop overall, and then all of a
mm,
sudden you're basically eroding. If you think about engagement effectiveness, the reduction in the effectiveness of your contacts with the customer is effectively a write down on the technology investments
mm,
that you've made.
mm.
So it's really important to be thoughtful about the way this is.
Do you think we've almost like with digital technology, I suppose, and digital contacts, we've got lulled into almost like this almost like false sense of security or false sort of equivalence, I suppose, which is like it costs so little to do another contact that people just put it out there because like the
Yeah.
return is probably there. But I remember the first time we chatted, we talked a bit of almost like a decay curve of contact. So every time you try and make the next contact, it's less effective, it's less effective, it's less effective, which is kind
Yeah.
of just what you were saying, right? It's almost like a
There's
like
the
an
half.
exponential decay.
There's
Yeah.
a half. The minute. So it's an interesting point that you're making. I'd say there's two problems, right? The long problem and the short problem. So
Mm,
in the short term, you end up with like the decay rate is going to happen no matter what because people get habituated to messaging. But the
mm,
more you do messaging, the more you load them up, the faster the decay rate is, right? And
mm,
so your effectiveness by being kind of like a shotgun like pattern, like just trying to throw everything at it, you're actually exasperating the decay problem. And the
yeah.
decay problem is already getting pretty bad because of the forces that I highlighted, including all the spamming and including like all everything else that they're getting in the market. Plus, we're living in a world where, for the first time, the bulk of the workforce was born into social media, and that
Mm,
has a pretty big trick. Like it's almost like that when you're born into it, it has a remapping of your brain and the way you receive
mm,
digital information, and so that half life is accelerating. You shouldn't try to make it worse. So that's one
mm,
thing. That's the immediate thing. There's actually a bigger impact that a lot of companies don't measure, like not correctly anyway. I haven't seen maybe one, which is can you draw an attribution between the customer experience in the near term? What they do is they measure the immediate thing. Do they open
mm,
this thing? Do they pay the bill? Like they're worried about this journey, this outcome, right?
mm,
What they don't think about is the survival rate of customers over time as you deliver a very poor experience, or alternatively, as you deliver a very positive
mm,
experience, the lifetime value, because that would be like I always use this example. It's a kind of like waves on the shore, reshaping the rock little by little over a
mm,
longer window of time. And most people's metrics and KPIs are very short. So getting to the payment today or getting them to buy something today is really, really important. The long-term way that your messaging strategy is impacting the way they think about you,
mm,
it's think about, imagine if a company was instead a person, right? And now it's me. Let's say I'm to Acme Telco and you're my customer, but let's personify telco in a human being. If I badgered you every day and I
mm,
treated you poorly over the long run, the next time you wanted to go get a beer, I probably
mm,
am not your first phone call. Like
yeah.
that happens almost subconsciously, right? And people don't measure that properly and they don't track it properly. We're big believers in it, which is like the long-term improvement of that relationship has incredible impact. But in order for you to actually care about that, you need to think about long-term shareholder value, long-term brand and relationship value between customers and the organizations. Most of these companies aren't scorecarded like that, to be
Yeah.
honest.
I mean, some of that stuff's come up over here where we talk to you about like vulnerable customers or customers getting into financial difficulty. And it's almost like this marketing problem around how do you almost like prime the messaging so when they do get into difficulty, they know what to do and you're a trusted partner kind of thing. I mean, how do we best think about measuring that? Because it always becomes a question, right? I'm going to spend all this money over here. I'm not getting anything back, even though you're saying, well, you probably are, but it might be in 6 months' time, right?
Yeah, so that's where I mean, look, it's this is one of the things that we look at is the impact that we're having not on any one. So the smallest unit of measure is the impact that you're having with this outreach. The next
Yeah.
unit of measure is the relationship that you're having with the customer across this journey. Then the
Mm,
next unit of measure is the way that your experiences overall are impacting that customer and that cohort of customers. So all the lookalikes, their
mm,
relationship with every decision they have to make about your brand, right?
mm,
So that last piece, you have to measure it. It's
mm,
doable because what you're looking at is, okay, what is the attribution between what I do when I zoom all the way in and the next level that I zoom out and then the
mm.
next level that I zoom out. And then you measure those lane impacts over time.
Yeah, I mean, all of this requires quite a lot of data, I suppose, and understanding and infrastructure to be able to do that. I mean, like, what kind of infrastructure is kind of needed, and where are the gaps, and how are you helping sort of plug those gaps to a certain extent?
So it's a good question on data. So that if you look at five 10 years ago or whatever like that, a third party augmentation was the biggest thing, right? Like, so the people
Mm,
would scrape and buy data from data vendors and the bid profiles and things like that. You're seeing, Europe is actually leading the charge. The FCA is one of the most progressive
mm,
regulatory bodies out there. But everybody else is going to follow. The world in general is not going to become less regulated when it comes to
mm,
privacy and
mm,
consumer data. Everywhere, generally, like people might be on different points on the path, but the world is becoming more restrictive when it comes to
mm,
things like this. So the way that's our belief at least. And so with that belief as an underlying ethos, guiding principle, really there's only two types of data that you can use: first party data about the customer, their financial transactions, all of the things that they're doing with you specifically. And then in the world of engagement, second party data that you're gaining from the telemetry that you're measuring and recording
mm,
as you run the campaigns. Now,
mm,
within that telemetry, you still have two sub buckets. One is we call engagement telemetry. Where are you spending time? Where are you clicking? Where are you opening? How do you navigate through things, right? What time
mm,
of day is this all occurring, right? Like getting the richness of how are they interacting with the communications, not one note at a time, but
mm,
profiling it as like journeys and journeys over journeys. So that kind of three-dimensional system. The second part, type of second party data that I think is pretty important is tagged information. So if you're using, let's say, behavioral science and you're building a gradient where you're basically using one behavioral strategy on this message, and depending on how they interact with it dynamically, you're going this way or that way and using another
mhm,
behavioral tactic, that dynamic synthesis of the science into the campaign needs to be tagged. And
mm,
if you can tag that and combine it with the engagement telemetry and then map that with, in an abstracted way, of course, but if then you map that with the first party data that you have, then you have this real. And if you think about the speed of that measurement coming in and being refreshed with every interaction, then all of a sudden you have personas and profiles about you specifically, Chris, and all the lookalikes that look similar to you, and the lookalike profiling and clustering can evolve over time. Then all of a sudden you have a really rich way of understanding your
yeah.
customers, which you can then translate into how to interact with them.
What about the speed of the feedback loop, almost like of these algorithms? You talked about tagging different behavioral routes, all those sort of things. I mean, and one might be more successful than another, and it's going to change over time. It might change over time with customers or cohorts. What about this, the speed of almost like the speed of the algorithm in terms of like recommending what the next step is, or recommending what
That
the
has
next
to be.
path is? I mean, how quickly does that kind of evolve?
Yeah, it depends on the like. I always tell people that the speed of the way you can evolve a system like this is a byproduct. Because if you think about the number of different components now in the equation that you're
Mm,
optimizing, you have segmentation, then you have the campaign, then you have all of the logic and the conditional stuff that goes into it. Then you have the tactics that are being synthesized into the scripts. You can even have more than one primary, secondary in the way they are placed together. Then it's like the gradient of the way they're rolled out over time within a campaign and campaign over campaign. It becomes like a pretty big system.
yeah.
So this is where AI is super helpful, right? Because at the end of the day, it gives you an ability to surface insights about what's working and what's not, so you can
Mm,
learn and iterate fairly quickly. So that's really one of the key applications of AI is once you get your life quite complicated, like being able to kind of manage the complicated in a user accessible way. I will say that as we take these large data sets, normally you got to be very mindful about not trying to kill a fly with an elephant gun.
mm,
So like you can build a platform that can be insanely complex, but it's about the way it's configured and set up. And what I've always recommended to customers is think about the customers that you have, think about what you're trying to achieve, think about how many customers you have, because you
mm.
want to be able to separate signal from noise. And so what you want to do is strike the right balance in terms of complexity against the population, so you don't end up with like more noise than signal, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and I suppose to a certain extent, if you look at social media as an example, they use some of these the feedback algorithms. I mean, but there's a difference between like doing it across, at scale in the consumer kind of world versus doing it even in financial services, which is like slightly different kind of scale in terms of like the number of segments you can have, I'd imagine.
Mm.
So I mean, how do you take into account that? Because if you have too many segments, you have like segments of one or less than one with no population in it. It becomes kind of like meaningless to a certain extent. You get into those kind of accuracy kind of issues because you don't have the data to reinforce it.
Well, that's kind of what I was suggesting. Is like you
Yeah.
can introduce hyper personalization inside of a cluster, so you can basically use scripting attributes that basically say,
Mm,
"Hey, this message pull in this very specific, unique information about the individual, and look back in history about what they did in the past, and allow that to inform what they see today." So you can do
mm,
that without creating, depending on the platform, of course, without creating segments of one. The thing that what you're talking about is absolutely right. Like if I give you a system that has, let's say, and there's a bunch of risk segments that come in to our system, and then we're subsegmenting from a behavioral and engagement standpoint within it. So now we have a matrix. Well, even if I think small, like let's say there is 5 risk segments, and then across that we have 5 buying personas. Now we have a
mm,
25 grid system. Within
mm,
that, there's a whole bunch of dynamicism. Well, if you only have 10,000 delinquencies a day,
mm,
and you try to put it through that kind of,
mm.
you're not going to learn much. Like it's
Yeah.
going to take you time. So if you want your in learning and your granularization against the population to in an attributable data first, science first way, you want to build that out, you would need to start smaller.
Yeah.
And it's so amazing. Like we go into companies and they're so sure about what they've done in terms of risk, and I'm
Mm,
like, have you run a test to see if you collapse these two? They look awfully similar, and
yeah.
then did something differently on engagement against them. Would it even make a difference? Would it be better? Would it be worse? Do you have a handle on this?
Yeah.
And oftentimes they've been sold really, really complicated things out of the gate by whatever vendor, and they haven't gone to the world of complicated incrementally over time. They've
Mm,
just implemented something very big upfront. And we've had examples where we're like, hey, I think you can collapse these 15 segments into 9
mm,
and rebuild, and you won't be any worse off.
mm.
And we've been right. So
Yeah.
it's,
Well, I suppose that's the value of experience, I suppose, and having that human oversight, isn't it? In terms of like the experience from a science point of view, just in terms of like materiality and sort of, that
yeah.
that kind of sense check to a certain extent. Um, I mean, you're making my head kind of explode just in terms of like measuring the effectiveness of all of this stuff as well, because you've got all this complexity going on, you've got the data going on, you've got a wealth of attributes that are going on. Just look at interaction kind of data in a contact channel. How do we best think about reporting on that? And particularly around things like evidencing whether that was a good outcome or not, or did it actually achieve the outcome? And what's the sort of the tools and techniques that you think about in that kind of area?
Well, the most simple way is to do a bunch of A/B tests, but that was invented 20 years ago. That's not
Mm,
really much.
yeah.
Again, like the challenge that you get when you get into A/B testing and things like that is because it's an interdependent journey
Mm,
of a sequenced nodes that are highly interdependent and correlated to each other. So what you do here may look good, but really, what are the downstream impacts, and
mm,
how does it impact the next cycle in, and things of that
mm,
nature? So the what we typically it's a multivariable equation that you're really optimizing for, and
mm,
there's interdependency. So what you
mm,
like, so for example, and oftentimes we have to partner with our customers and kind of coach them through some of these things, because what they'll end up doing is making decisions like, hey, I'm going to change this because
mm,
I want to change X because I want Y outcome. And I'm like, X doesn't exist in
mm,
isolation from the rest of the system. So you may achieve Y, but the downstream impacts of this, if you care about these other things, could be materially worse.
mm,
So what we've always tried to do is to build what is the business case exercise for the client to say,
mm,
all these variables matter. They matter in a certain proportion and a ratio. So then you can define those ratios, create the optimization equation that you're looking for. And then every permutation, every node, every iteration is against that X equation rather than any one KPI.
mm. You're making me think there a little bit about expert systems, or I suppose expert policy rules as an example. We used to have expert rules and you have data-led rules. And at what point does it become a bit of a conflict between the data says this, but the expert, which is what we all like humans basically think the world works like this, which is like almost like a different type of AI. I mean, how much of a conflict does that become between the data says this, but our opinion says that? I mean, can that be a challenge in terms of implementing some of
Yeah,
the best strategies?
I would frame it the other way, which is like, look, the human can have a hypothesis based on the data, but they shouldn't be able to just go with their judgment and their
Mm,
hypothesis unless the data validates it. So that's been our policy always, is that, and I think having people on top of this is an important guardrail. Like,
mm,
one thing we haven't talked about is the power of generative AI, not in terms of generating text. That's like the easiest example of what you can do with
mm,
that stuff, but rather for you to be able to prompt and query your information. And so if you
mm,
have a large data set and you're trying to build a multivariate equation and optimize it and introduce AI into it, etc., if you put Gen AI on top of it, now the
mm,
language that it's not SQL or whatever, it's actually in the English language is the language with which you're interfacing with your information to
mm,
create equations, to create, because then it can convert that to syntax to,
mm,
and basically you can create scripts effectively
mm,
using the English language, and those scripts can define the things that you're optimizing for.
mm,
And you can actually daisy chain kind of these components together and be able to have single point control over a fair, like a sequence of components in a large system. So
mm.
that's where we get really excited, is that I think doing the complicated thing will become more accessible for
Yeah.
people that are trained properly. The key thing is you're still going to need people that are trained properly. I don't think you're going to be able to, at least today, and again, I said at the beginning of the conversation, I think this is my views at a point in time, and it may change, but I don't think you can get rid of the people. I
Yeah.
don't. I think what people can do and do quickly with massively lower costs, there's already been a seismic shift in that, and it's
Yeah.
going to get even bigger.
I kind
But
of
I
see
don't
it.
think you can get away from human judgment.
Yeah, I kind of see it as almost like it adds an extra arm to the human to be able to do more, and it
Boom.
takes away some of the stuff that we don't necessarily want to do. Some of the more mundane stuff, you can get it to do some of that stuff. You might be able to do it, but it might take a lot of thought, and it gives you a bit of a lift up to a certain extent.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Basic examples that I have, basic examples that I have are things, for example, like analytical work that again,
Mm,
especially if it's multi-component in nature, that was a team in days, right? Like,
mm,
it's not easy to do. Like, and
mm.
that's still the paradigm in most companies, which is, I got to go do this thing over here, then pull the data. Like, we have clients like this still, where
Yeah.
the state that we walk into is siloed components and a lot of data scientists and a lot of analysts. And
Mm,
what the future state will be, and Symend, I believe, will be a part of that future, is, and the way we view the world is that, like, reducing the friction of doing that job
mm,
improves the likelihood significantly of that job being done well to generate value. And so
mm.
the minute you have a lot of friction in it, and the minute you have complexity, you may technically be able to do the job, but as soon as you get busy, it falls apart. Like, the more
Yeah.
coordination, the more effort that something requires, the less likely you are to do it well.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in terms of state of adoption, particularly in, say, financial services, some of the collections kind of areas, what do you see the opportunities in terms of state of adoption of some of these technologies, like be it behavioral science, behavioral scoring, be it even some of the contact and the data stuff, the ability to be able to use it? I mean, what's your sense around, I suppose, development and where we're going from here?
In terms of the data,
The data, but also the science and putting these kind of tools and techniques into the industry.
it's
How much of an
moving very
opportunity is
fast.
there?
Like, I think we're in a really cool point in time, honestly. Yeah, budgets are tight, this and that, but like, well, it's an I've had to convince people the least
Mm,
recently that this is important.
mm,
Um, that, when we're trying to like evangelize for a problem, the first thing we do is convince people that this is a problem you should care about, and here's
mm,
our view of the way that problem can be solved or
Mm.
incrementally mitigated. Um, the first part is making them believe, right?
Mm.
And so that it feels like I'm preaching to the converted most of the time these
Mm.
days. It's
Yeah.
a much easier journey, and so that part is getting better and better by the day, and we're getting
Mm.
more and more buy-in faster. It almost feels like they were waiting for us to arrive. The part that I still think is challenging for big orgs is I think there's just so much stuff that they can do,
Mm.
and they are moving in such a cautious manner that it's going to take time for them to do the transformation and do it properly. I also hear about lots and lots of companies, and again, like I'm not trying to like make this a plug for Symend, but the typical enterprise software solution like that from a company that built their software 10, 20 years ago is a 12-month to 24-month implementation and millions of dollars up front just to turn the lights on. And that is a big decision, and it takes a long time and it fails half the time, right? Like they run
Mm.
out of money. I just in the last year I've seen a bunch of these things stall out and get written off, right?
Mm.
Or take something that there's one company where they bought a piece of software before they bought Symend,
Mm.
and we'd already been delivering value for a year. They bought it
Mm.
for like a couple of months. I think it was like 1 or 2 quarters before they bought Symend. They bought this
Mm.
other thing, and by the time they bought Symend, we turned it on. We started delivering value. A year had gone by of us delivering value before they turned
Mm.
the other thing even on. Like
Yeah.
these old school software companies are, and I mean, again, somebody's getting paid off that, right? Like there's
Mm.
consultants, there's professional services, there's system integrators. So I think a lot of that work should be automated away. And I think we are and are going to be incrementally more at the point where a lot of that hard stuff, especially if the foundations, your data platforms, everything else is solid and you're building effectively data centric applications on top of it correctly, I think you should. I think one of the biggest unlocks is going to be the speed at which people can test, try, innovate,
Mm.
and hopefully in the future trying things is not going to be such a big decision anymore, because I think
Yeah.
that's the way companies should be built. But they've lost some of their agility over time, and I think things like the cloud and CDPs and things like that, I think they're going to solve a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've seen, huge amounts of change even in the last sort of 5 years with the cloud and sort of the ability to adopt and put things into play. I mean, the speed of acceleration and what I'm hearing is really based off some of the technology, even over the last year, it's probably going to get even faster. So we can trial and try out things even faster as well. So
Yeah, that's exactly it. We want to live in a world. We onboarding Symend is light years faster than anything else, but it's still slow. Like the
yeah,
reality of it is, I want it to be even faster. I want
yeah,
like clients to be able to basically say, I want to tell everybody in large every major enterprise, like, hey, for no cost and no friction, you can switch this on, try it, and if you like it, great, and if you don't, that's okay too. Like
right.
that's the world that we should live in, where friction is not a moat,
Mm.
right? Like technical friction. Because
Mm.
if that's the only reason why you're doing business with someone is because it's too hard to do business with other people, that's
Yeah,
the like, I mean, that is friction. A lot of big companies have been built that way. But I think
yeah,
that's the worst kind of friction, is the one where I have no other choice rather
yeah,
than I'm excited and delighted to work with you every day.
yeah, yeah. I'll write that down. Friction is not a moat. I like that. So last question. So if we to have the same conversation in 5 years' time, what do you think we'll be talking about? I mean, where are we going from here?
The part that I'm the most excited about is like the applications of Gen AI beyond just scripting, right? Like so the
Mm.
things and research and all of the obvious use cases, the bigger
Mm.
use cases, like the one that I just mentioned about the way it's going to change the way we can interface with data and create
Mm.
equations and pick models and apply those models to our data to kind of
Mm.
to solve problems and execute workflows.
Yeah,
I think that piece where scripting becomes unnecessary and you can basically English language could be the way you can interact with complicated information.
mm.
I think we're in the infancy of that, honestly. Like I
Yeah,
work with the tools every day right now, and we're not even at the first inning yet. I think we're
yeah,
very early, and it's already transformative, and I think it's going to be more transformative still. And anybody who's working in the fields of data analysis, data science, engagement, so anything where the underpinnings of how you make a decision, your job is to make decisions, and a lot of data is required as inputs into how that decision is made. I would encourage you guys, anybody who's going to listen to this, to spend an hour a day learning about AI stuff and the way and what's
Yeah.
coming, and try stuff. Like I just signed up for, as a hobby on my weekends now, I've signed up for a AI filmmaking course. Now,
Okay.
my job has nothing to do with AI filmmaking, but the
Yeah.
things that they're doing, they're able to personalize commercials to the individual and render them in 10 minutes. I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I got to learn that stuff because I think it's
Yeah.
going to have huge implications to society at large. So
Yeah.
I just encourage you to, if you're passionate about it, you got to get your hands on it. Like, you got to
Yeah.
try it, you got to work with it. And I think every professional's job in a traditional white collar business like a bank and a telco will be different in 10 years.
Yeah.
Everyone. No
Yeah.
one will be no one will be exempted from needing to be an expert at this stuff to continue to be successful in their careers. And so I
But I
think
suppose,
learning it is really, really key.
yeah, I suppose part of the optimism of that is it's, I mean, the jobs are going to change, not necessarily go away. It's going to be more user friendly than it was before. I mean, you just need to understand how the dynamics work to a certain extent.
Yeah, like again, this is like 100 years ago, the number one industry in the U.S. was making ice, and then the
Mm.
fridge came along and
Yeah.
just blew that out of the water. Those people didn't disappear. They did other things. They made fridges. They
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
assembled, like, they did cooler things. And so
Yeah.
I'm excited. I mean, look, I can just speak to the people that are in my circle, but
Yeah.
most people that I talk to who are involved with the data, the fact that all of this low level work is going to get automated and they're going to be puppet masters and master
Mm.
orchestrators, it will require it. The biggest thing it's going to require is that you're being strategic, and being
Mm.
the orchestrator is what's valuable. And so if you can make that mental shift, then your productive velocity is going to be better than ever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Hanif, thanks very much for the time. I really appreciate it. I know it's early in the morning where you are. You got calls coming in now, so but I really appreciate making the time. It's
No
fantastic.
problem.
Always interesting to chat with you. I love our conversations. So I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Have a great day.
Okay, thanks. Cheers.